In Horizon, the primary victim of encroachment on native lands is fragile white innocence, as embodied by the romanticism with which Costner captures Frances and Elizabeth. In attempting to correct the myths perpetuated by classic westerns, Horizon creates one of its own, turning manifest destiny into a big ol' manifest oopsie.
The critical reaction to Kevin Costner's Horizon has been strange. We're in a time when both critics and audiences alike are saying how tired they are of never-ending sequels and reboots, how frustrated they are with the greed and the callousness of movie studios during and after the writer's strike. Then along comes Horizon, an original film independently financed and of a size and scope that competes directly with the studios, but which is then gleefully savaged by critics and dismissed as a self-indulgent vanity project. For as much as the artistic establishment claims to want something new and different, it still seems like the stuck-up nail gets hammered down. It's a shame because Horizon is actually quite good. It's sweeping, it's complex, it's nice to look at. Is it above criticism? No. Is it deserving of the sort of thrashing it's received from some critics? Not at all. So why did Horizon get so much flack? Well, one of the most mindlessly recycled criticisms is that Horizon would be better as a TV show. Now, I'm not big on these multi-part films either, but then I don't remember hearing any of these criticisms about Dune Part 1 or Mission Impossible, which had similar structural issues in that each is only part of a larger narrative. When I hear this would be better as a streaming show, I can't help but hear a sort of disdain for ambition. I can't help but hear this would be better if it was lost in a quagmire of indistinguishable digital slop. More than that, Horizon's grand scope reminds me more of a comfy novel than it does a show on streaming. The pace is deliberate but never dull. The film lays the groundwork for something that, if it's able to maintain its current trajectory, has the potential to be one of the last great cinematic achievements. I am looking forward to Part 2. What seems to have drawn the most ire from critics, but which is also one of Horizon's greatest strengths, is that it dares to approach the subject of American expansionism with a certain degree of complexity. An Apache attack on a new settlement is carried out with unflinching brutality. The settlers are depicted sympathetically. The audience is made to fear for the settlers' lives. At the same time, there's no mistaking why the Apaches carried out the attack. As Sam Worthington's character explains, the settlers aren't supposed to be there. Their arrival displaces the native hunting grounds and throws the many different tribes into conflict with one another. Meanwhile, the film makes a point of showing there's disagreement even among the Apaches about what to do about the settlers. The older generation wants to keep the peace, while the younger generation wants to get rid of them before they can really take root. Later, a group of scalp hunters are introduced who maybe make no real distinction between the Apaches who carried out the attack and the other tribes who might have been just minding their own business. If the initial attack is meant to instill sympathy for the settlers and condemnation for the Apaches, Costner then spends the rest of the film adding color and context to the conflict so that by the end we arrive at, dear God help us, something nuanced and complex. For some critics, however, that complexity seems to be a sin. David Rooney for The Hollywood Reporter writes, "What's most perplexing coming from Costner is the uncomfortably long time the film takes to show sensitivity towards its indigenous characters. We're well into Horizon before the perspective on native resistance is broadened to acknowledge that their murderous attacks on new settlements are a direct response to the occupation of their ancestral lands. It's very confusing to see a Western in 2024 and find yourself thinking, wait, so American Indians are the bad guys again? The complaint here isn't that the film never shows the natives' perspective, only that it takes too long. Okay, here's part of a review from Vox. It's also, despite its best efforts at creating sympathy for indigenous Americans, borderline offensive, with an intense, violent depiction of a nominally unprovoked Apache raid that takes up nearly the first third of the film. The sequence does its very best to make settlers seem like the innocent victims in all this. Here's a selection from IGN's review.
There's a viciousness to the way Costner films the town's native attackers, who indiscriminately slaughter white children, and while he attempts to eventually provide some level of dimension to these events, the images and the Western cliches they embody are hard to shake. It's a particularly retrograde depiction, especially disappointing to see in a post-Killers of the Flower Moon world.
I don't understand. Is the contention that these attacks never took place? Is the contention that they shouldn't be depicted on film? Would the critics prefer that the Apache be depicted as gullible saps who never act until it's too late? It's one thing to say filmmakers should be more thoughtful in their depictions of Native Americans. It's another to say that they can never be depicted as even sympathetic antagonists. For critics like these, it's not just the brutality of the Apache's attack that's the problem. The problem is that the viewer is meant to sympathize with the settlers. Across multiple reviews, there's the common refrain of, "It's 2024, how could you? Why isn't this more like Killers of the Flower Moon?" For RogerEbert.com, Robert Daniels writes, "As much as Costner tries to play an even hand, attempting to give the indigenous and settler perspective equal attention, it doesn't wholly work. Yes, we meet the family of the Apache warriors, but their screen time pales in comparison to their white counterparts. It also doesn't help that the white women characters are, for the most part, so clean and luminous, nary a speck of dust on them despite their grungy surroundings, that they appear angelic on screen. You see, the real problem is that the white women are too pretty. If appealing to artistic freedom isn't enough, maybe the barely restrained racism should be a clue that some critics are more out to, excuse the phrase, collect a scalp than they are to critique a film. What many of these criticisms amount to is that the film doesn't display enough deference to modern progressive orthodoxy. There's been a new set of patch notes, and there's really only one way you're allowed to tell this story anymore. There has to be a certain amount of finger wagging. A story such as this must be approached from a place of enlightened presentism, a new and improved moral certainty that knows exactly who the good guys and bad guys are. A critic for something called Zoomer writes, "Retroactively treating the frontier as the direction in which we were always headed is a slick way to absolve individual settlers of making the decision, then and now, to benefit from genocide." Damn, if only these early American settlers would have listened to NPR. If only they had Twitter. Who cares if some of them could barely read or write? Who cares if the average life expectancy was 45? They should have known better. It's funny because Costner does make one clumsy modernist concession in that Native Americans are repeatedly referred to as indigenous. Was indigenous in the parlance of the time? I don't know for sure, but it sounded off to me. More than just taking a stance on the side of creative freedom, there is an artistic benefit to showing a more complex, less partisan view of Western expansion. For all the talk of Horizon being a throwback to a more bygone age, there is, at its core, themes that are very much applicable to the here and now, but which Hollywood seems keen to gloss over. Chief among them is the idea that conflict, and conflict between cultures specifically, is inherent to almost every group of people throughout history. People compete for resources, they compete for a certain way of life. It turns out it's not just a simple matter of repeating diversity is our strength and hoping for the best. It's also not just a simple matter of assigning blame. The progressive impulse to assign blame and apply moral absolutes to a time and place they have almost zero ability to comprehend comes from what I can only assume is a desire for unchecked retribution. Once you've established blame, once you've assigned a clear enemy, anything is permissible. This is, of course, the complete opposite of what Horizon seems to be driving towards. Horizon's trajectory seems to be the setting aside of blame, breaking the cycle of violence and trying to make something better for the future. Heck, it's implied in the title. Like Costner's proposed four-part saga itself, the ultimate fate of which is still up in the air, the horizon is somewhere you might never arrive, but which you strive toward nonetheless. Okay, but who cares what critics think in the first place? It wouldn't be the first time critics were wrong, and it won't be the last. And why focus so much on rebutting progressives? Everyone's got their biases. Of course it's going to color someone's judgment of a piece of art. But then that's just it, is this notion that there is one side of the critical equation, the side motivated by angry YouTubers and culture war outrage, the side that review bombs, that has ulterior motives when approaching a piece of media, and then there's the other side that is completely objective, expert scholars in cinema, simple arbiters of taste. But then I think some of the critical reaction to Horizon is a reminder that that's not the case. Sure, a critical body might appear objective when for a long time nothing challenges their consensus in any meaningful way, but as audiences demand something new and different, and as some filmmakers' attempts to give them that arrive at something more traditional, I imagine the biases of some mainstream critics will become much more apparent. The old will appear as new, while the progressive will strive to conserve the status quo.